6, so we'll go ahead and get started, and then I'll admit people as they're coming in here. So let's get this. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight into this evening's Curious by Nature. We're super excited to have Dr. Russ Benedict, a professor of biology at Central College. So one of the mammals that Dr. Benedict studies is bats, a very misunderstood and very feared animal now more than ever, as the world is still coping with the coronavirus, which is thought to have originated in bats. But we're here to help our audience gain more knowledge and understanding of these animals and hopefully dispel a lot of misconceptions and confusion surrounding bats. So that's my little spiel and intro. Dr. Russ Benedict, welcome, and I'll let you take over.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for asking me to do this. I'm always pretty happy to give good PR to bats. They have, for whatever reason, they have always needed the good PR, and then as Lydia mentioned, yeah, they really need it now. So what I want to do is just to give you, we'll start with a little bit of just kind of general info about bats. And then we'll jump into kind of a quick tour of some of the local species that we have here in Iowa. I don't really have time to talk about all the species that are here in Iowa, but I'll talk about some of them. And then we'll talk about kind of some of the burning issues, the things that are going on right now. And so in particular, we'll do a little bit with just a tiny bit with wind turbines as a source of mortality. And then we'll do a fair amount with white nose syndrome. And then we'll jump into, as Lydia commented, kind of this fascinating and scary and important world of diseases that come from wildlife. So I got introduced to bats by one of my professors in college, and it literally was kind of love at first sight. I had gone out netting with him one night, and about halfway through that night, I just knew this was something I was going to do for the rest of my life. They're a really charismatic group of organisms once you get the chance to meet them in their environment. And they hook you. So I will invite you to come out and catch bats with me, but I'm going to warn you, you're going to become a bat lover if you're not already one. But it's interesting that if people have met bats in their home, those tend to be the people who are most afraid of bats, because anything that's in your home where you don't really expect it kind of becomes the enemy. But if you get the chance to meet them, like I said, out in their world, then it's just a different story. So I teach at Central. I teach introductory biology and then some conservation biology kinds of classes, and then a bunch of the animal biology type things, so mammalogy and ornithology. I teach a tropical ecology class. I may occasionally glance to the side like that because I've got a bird feeder right outside the window, and so I just had a rose-breasted grosbeak come in and eating sunflower seeds right in front of me. So if I get distracted, somebody just kind of yell at me because I'm probably looking at something cool on the bird feeders. Yeah, and so one of the beauties of working at a school like Central is that you really get to know students well. And so Jack was one of the students that hung out with me for a couple of years, and Jack became a member of the family. And that to me is kind of the beauty of working at a small school is, yeah, you get to watch people kind of explode right before your very eyes. And I don't know if there's a better example of that than Jack. But don't tell him I'm saying these nice things about him. We don't want him to know that I actually like him. Okay, so let's get on to bats here. So I like to do this kind of in quiz format to some extent. And so I'll ask you some quiz questions here. And if you want, since we've got a smaller group, you can just kind of unmute yourself and yell out an answer if you know it, or you can just pause and then I'll give you the answer anyways. Okay, so first of all, so bats are the only mammals that are capable of true flight. And so my question for you is, why am I clarifying true flight? In other words, what is the difference between a flying squirrel and what a flying squirrel does versus what a bat does? And so one is a glider, whereas one is true flight. And so in true flight, you flap your wings. And that seems pretty simple, but because you flap your wings, you can actually increase in elevation. Whereas if you're a glider, like a flying squirrel, you can't flap your wings, and therefore all you ever do is descend. Now, they can descend for a long ways, but they can't ever go up unless like they just get caught in a freak blast of wind. But this fact that you can flap your wings means that you can potentially fly literally for hours and hours, and it kind of opens the door to all new levels of maneuverability. Okay. If you look worldwide, a huge percentage of mammals are bats. So we've got a little bit over 1,200 species of bats. By the way, that total number, what is the exact number of species? We just don't know. And even really well-known organisms like birds, we still don't know the answer there, partially because there are unexplored parts of the world, but also because our understanding of what is a species is actually changing. As we get deeper and deeper into the genetic work, we start realizing that what is a species is actually a really complicated question. So just to give you a quick little hint, in the bird world, there's ballpark about 12,000 named species, but there's one group of scientists out there that are arguing that we should really use a different definition for what is a species, and that would jump us up to about 26,000 species of birds. So it's kind of interesting that something we think of as just really basic, it's a species. Obviously, we know what that is. Well, no, actually, we don't. So here is your next quiz question. So if there's 1,200 species of bats, then how many species live here in this part of the world? Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Okay, so the answer is in Iowa. We'll just limit ourselves to Iowa. So either 9 or 11, kind of depending upon how you want to define that. So there's 9 species that breed in Iowa, and then another 2 that pop in from time to time. So I have, it says there on the screen 8 or 9, because this talk I also sometimes give to folks in Minnesota, and Minnesota only has 8. But Iowa has 9, and then these other 2 that just pop in from time to time. So if you think about that for a second, so if there's 1,200 species of bats, you would expect, just based on how big the Midwest is, you'd expect us to have more species than that. And so, in other words, we're getting shortchanged, basically, in terms of the number of species that we have. So that kind of raises a good question. So if we don't have as many bats as you really should expect, why is that? Where are the bats? And the answer to that really is the same as it is for most organisms. And that is that the tropics have huge numbers of species. And then as you head away from the tropics, the number of species decreases. So yeah, if you, I've take a lot of students to Costa Rica. That's one of the places we go every other winter break. And when we go there, Costa Rica is a little bit smaller than Iowa, but last I knew they had 114 species that have been recorded there. So you just see these huge numbers of species when you head south. Okay, here's your next question, next quiz question. Which other living mammals are the closest relatives of bats? And I'll give you a hint on this one. It is a kind of animal that lives here in Iowa. But I'll also give you another hint. When people say things like, bats are rats with wings, are they right about that? So is rodents the answer to this question? And the answer to that is no, rodents are not the answer to this question. The closest living relatives of bats are these little guys called shrews. And we got a couple different species of shrews here in Iowa. They're actually pretty common. But if you look at DNA structure and skull structure and tooth structure, it's very clear. If you want to call bats something, call them flying shrews, but don't call them flying mice or flying rats, because that's just not accurate. Okay, now, so the average bat is a pretty small critter. Now, this picture that I'm showing you here, this is a bat from down in the desert southwest of the US. This guy's a little bit on the small size in terms of like average size, but still it makes the point pretty well that most bats are small. So the biggest bat that we have in Iowa weighs about as much as about 2 car keys or so. And so they are just small critters. But yet, despite that size, they have enormous impacts on ecosystems. So now your next quiz question is, what are the 3 major ways that bats impact ecosystems? And I'm going to guess you can probably come up with number 1. They are really important predators of insects that are out flying at night. So in fact, the guess is that with the exception of spiders, bats probably are the most important predator of night flying insects. Okay, but numbers 2 and 3 most people here in the Midwest don't really get because we don't see it here in the Midwest. But they are really important pollinators. By the time you get down to about the desert Southwest, and then from points south from there, you have lots and lots of species that are feeding from flowers, eating pollen and nectar, and in the act of doing that, they're spreading pollen. Nobody really knows just how big this is, but the guesses are down in tropical regions, maybe 10, maybe 25% of plants are pollinated largely or entirely by bats. So really important groups. If you like tequila, tequila is a plant, or tequila is made from a plant that is what am I trying to say here? Pollinated entirely by bats. And then another thing that you see down in the tropics is there are lots of fruit-eating bats, and that there are lots of plants that are adapted then for the bats to disperse their seeds around. And so kind of typical is what we see in birds then, you've got some sort of a berry with a seed inside, and the bat either regurgitates the seed or poops it out later. But one way or another, they're dispersing seeds. And super important. There's been a fair amount of research on this. So for instance, in Africa, if you go in and clear cut a rainforest, but if you still have existing rainforest next to it, about 80 to 90% of the rain of seeds for the first 10 years after logging into that area is all from bats. So it's really important in helping ecosystems to kind of recover themselves. All right, this picture, you can actually spend about an hour looking at this picture and talking about various aspects of bat biology, but I'll just kind of cut it quick here. Speaking of which, I better find myself a clock, because sometimes what I do is I get pretty excited about what I'm talking about, and the next thing I know, it's like 6 hours later and I'm still talking. But at any rate, so a couple of things to notice here. So first of all, the wings are simply their hands. And it's kind of interesting to contrast bat wings and bird wings, because birds have really heavily modified the skeleton that supports their wings. It also is their forelimbs, it's also their hands, but they've really modified the bones. Bats really haven't modified them all that much. What they've done is to lengthen the bones. But other than lengthening the bones, they really haven't done some of the things that birds have done. Birds have lost bones and fused other bones together. But really, if you can just look at your own hand and your own forearm, you're seeing the exact same bones that you find in a bat. So from right here, the first bone, then's the humerus. Then right here is the forearm, so the radius and the ulna. This mass right here is the palm of the hand. That's the thumb sticking forward. Then you can see there's two bones here side by side. That's the index finger and then the ring finger, or the middle finger. Here is the ring finger, and then that's the pinky. But just look at yourself for a second, kind of look at your dimensions. Then notice that your forearm is about as long as your humerus is, okay? But not on these guys. Notice that the forearm is ballpark twice the length of the humerus. Okay, so they've lengthened the forearm, but now look at the fingers. So the middle finger starts right here and actually ends way out here, just a little bit into the blue off the screen. So their middle finger is almost like 4 times, 5 times longer than the humerus is. So they've greatly elongated bones, but other than that, all of the bones are still there, okay? Then they just create this thin sheet of skin that connects all of the fingers to each other, then wraps down here and joins to the hind legs, comes down and includes the tail. So this is kind of where the magic happens, is all this thin sheet of skin. You notice that there's these parallel strips out in there. So those are strips of muscle, so they can really control the shape of the flight membrane. So if they hold their right wing in a slightly different position than the left wing, that will cause them to turn. So there's kind of just a cool overall view of how they have created those wings. But then do notice this hunk of skin that goes in between the two back legs and includes the tail. That's what's called the tail membrane. And so you can kind of imagine from where it's sitting that it can be used as a rudder to help them turn. But they also can use it to scoop up things. So they scoop up insects, often using their tail membrane. And then the last thing we'll look at here on this picture is, notice that this bat has a hole there and another hole there. And then some of these whitish areas over here are scars. So they do get holes poked in their flight membranes every once in a while when they fight with each other or hit a thorn or something like that. But they can quickly heal those up. Okay, so now this picture is just showing us a little bit on some of the variation that you see. And this is another one we can spend a lot of time talking about because there's a lot of cool things here, but we'll just kind of quickly do a couple of things. So notice this bat down in the lower left-hand corner. Um, and the main thing you'll notice about this guy is notice that it doesn't have a tail and it doesn't have a tail membrane. So you just have bare space there between the two hind legs. It actually has a tiny bit of a tail membrane. It's still there a little bit, but it's really greatly reduced. So that might make you wonder, why would you want to get rid of the tail membrane? Well, they can still steer by just holding their wings in different positions. So you can still steer even if you don't have a rudder. But wouldn't they need to catch insects? And the answer is, well, not if they're not an insect eater. So this is not an insect eater. And then there's another hint that will tell you what this guy feeds on. It's a little bit hard to tell. You would need more of a side view, but he's got a long snout. And notice that his tongue is so long that he can't even pull his tongue back into his mouth. Okay, so this is one of the nectar and pollen feeders. Okay, so this is Anura is the name of this guy. And Anura, the genus, literally translates into without a tail. So this is Anura, and this is from down in Costa Rica. Okay, now what we're going to do with these two bats here, so this is the Townsend's big-eared bat from out in western U.S., and then this is the Brazilian free-tailed bat. If you've been into Carlsbad Caverns and watched the bats leave Carlsbad Caverns, this is who you're seeing is the Brazilian free-tailed bat. But look at the differences in wing design. So we've got relatively short wings, but they're very broad. And then we have long wings in this guy's case, and they're very pointed. Okay, and so that design is basically one of two things. And essentially you see this exact same thing in birds. And so if you're ever watching birds, watch for their wing dimensions. If you have short, broad wings, like the bat on top, you're really designed for maneuverability. You're not super efficient. You burn quite a bit of energy as you're flying along. You're not fast, but your maneuverability is through the roof. So this guy can fly in and among tight tree branches. It can hover in front of branches. So super maneuverability. The guy in the bottom, on the other hand, so the free-tailed bat down here is designed for long distance flight. They don't burn much energy. They fly pretty fast. That's what that long pointed wing gives you is high speed or relatively high speed and then great efficiency, but you're not very maneuverable. Okay, so there's just kind of trade-offs and two different ways of designing wings. Okay, now, one of the things that I hear from people a lot about bats is, they're so ugly. I just don't like them because they're ugly. And in honesty, that's kind of a silly response because how humans base appearances is in comparison to us. A beautiful human, I don't know if you've read any of the psychology on this, it's very interesting. A person who is beautiful is the person who is the most average. So it is the absolute most average of all features that we tend to find beautiful. So we're comparing beauty in relation to ourselves. So yeah, bats look different from us. So I guess automatically that's going to mean they look ugly. But some bats do have pretty cool looks. And if you understand why they have those looks, then you really aren't going to call them ugly anymore. You'll instead refer to them as being beautiful. So this is now that same bat we were just looking at a minute ago, the big-eared bat. And so this guy has some of the biggest ears on the planet in relation to its body size. And what it does is, it flies in and among tree branches, it hovers, and it's doing two things. It's echolocating for caterpillars, but it's also listening for the sound of caterpillars chewing. And you can probably imagine that caterpillars don't make an awful lot of noise when they chew. So you need to have incredible ears if A, you have some of the best echolocation on Earth, and B, you're literally finding your prey by hearing them chew. So incredible ears just for the purpose of incredible hearing. This next one has a cool story, and I don't have a lot of time for the stories here because I want to keep going quick. So this one, so my wife, who happens to be standing right in front of me right now, so she often joins me on my trip down to Costa Rica, and she's very good at getting bats out of mist nets, which is kind of an art form. When you go out and catch bats with mist nets, they're hard to catch and hard to untangle. So she's working on a bat somewhere, I don't know, a couple of, 50 feet away from me, and I'm working on another one. And she starts saying to me that, I don't know what kind of bat this is. I've never seen it before. And I say, well, describe it to me. So she describes a few things, and I start getting excited because there's a bat I've always wanted to see, but I've never seen before, and it sounds like what she's talking about. And then she ends her description with this statement that I remember to this day. She said, "It looks like it's been in some sort of a horrible accident." And so as soon as she said that, I knew who she was talking about. She was talking about this guy, the wrinkle-faced bat. And so this to me is kind of a classic example of, if you understand how something works, then even something that's kind of ugly, and I'll give you, this guy's not the best looking critter, but if you understand why it works, then they become beautiful. This is a fruit eater, but unlike most fruit eaters that eat little fruits, this guy, he does eat some little fruits, but he also hugs big fruits. This is not a very big bat, so it's a bat with about a 12-inch wingspan or so. And so they'll fly up to a fruit, they'll kind of sniff it to make sure it's properly ripe, and then they just grab it and wrap their wings around it, and they just start chewing. And a good chunk of their energy actually comes from fruit juice. So a researcher kind of heard about that and got an idea of, I wonder if that's what the face is all about. So he just took a colored dropper with colored fluid and just put drops of fluid all over the face. And everywhere he put the drops of fluid, it always flowed down to his mouth. So all the wrinkles are designed to funnel fluid down to the mouth. And it makes sense that you wouldn't have hair all over your face, because the hair would just catch that fluid. And so you wouldn't be able to get the fluid to drink. And then on top of that, you'd now have sticky juice all over your face, and that would make you more vulnerable to bacterial infections. So the bare face and then all those wrinkles are just all about drinking fruit juice. So that's the wrinkle-faced bat, and a really cool critter. And I think I've seen probably 6 or 7 of them now going down to Costa Rica, but they're just so much fun. Okay, here's a quick shot just showing you a bunch of the species. So again, the 9 species that regularly occur in the state. Some of them, if you can kind of follow my cursor here, some of them have bright colors, and so can be easily identified by their colors. So there's an eastern red bat and a silver-haired bat and a hoary bat. But then we've got a whole slug of them. So you can look at these guys kind of on the outsides here that are brown, and the brown ones are hard to tell apart. But hold on a second here, I'm clicking too fast. But what I want to do is just kind of go through a couple of the local species, especially telling some of the ones that either A, people are most likely to encounter, or B, the ones that have really interesting stories to them. So this is, if you have seen a bat in a house in Iowa, or in a church or anything like that, you've almost certainly seen the big brown bat. So this is the most common bat across the state. I refer to it usually as the robin of the bat world, because they are just found in all possible habitats. They're probably more common today than they ever have been in the past. So something that people encounter a lot, A, because they're in lots of different habitats, and B, because they live in our houses. But this is also a $1 billion bat. So this guy eats so many agricultural pests that its estimated impact on humans is at over $1 billion a year. Especially it eats it's either corn rootworm or corn borer. One of those two, the adult is a moth, and the other one, the adult is a beetle. And the one that has the adult as the beetle is the one this thing eats a whole bunch of. And so it's really a beneficial critter. Unfortunately, because it is mostly a beetle eater, it has big, strong teeth, and they're pretty feisty. And so if you try and grab a big brown bat, you're gonna get bit and it's gonna hurt. And so because they kind of have this attitude to them, in a way, I think it's kind of sad that they're the ones that people encounter the most, because they're pretty feisty, and they will definitely bite you if you try and grab them. There are a number of bats in the state that are really mild-mannered and gentle, and if that was the main bat that people encountered, I don't think people would be as afraid of bats as often as they are. Okay. People very commonly confuse big brown bats with little brown bats, and they're actually kind of hard to tell apart. But little brown bats are about half the body size, but yet their ears are larger not only are they larger in relation to their body size, but they're actually larger, even though they're a much smaller bat. And so this is another bat that up until just about a year or two was extremely common across, especially the northern parts of Iowa. But even here in the southern parts of Iowa where I live, they're still they're spotty in distribution, but when you get into one of the areas where they're present, there's lots of them. But there's been a couple of times where I've been netting up and over rivers and streams in northern Iowa, and you have to be real careful because you can end up with 50 or 60 little brown bats in your net in just no time, because they're very common critters. But this is one of the ones, and we'll talk a little bit about this here in a few minutes, that is declining pretty rapidly because of this white nose syndrome, this introduced species that we have here in the state. They will use buildings, and so in fact the picture there in the bottom is from a barn, and there's just two boards that are sitting next to each other with a gap in between, and that's where the bats cram themselves into. And there'll be sometimes hundreds crammed into a very small space. Okay, this is one of the guys I've done a lot of my research on. This is the Indiana bat, and Indianas are a federally endangered species. And they're actually pretty hard to distinguish from little brown bats. You have to see quite a few of them until you can really be confident at identifying them. They use a variety of forests. They're pretty much strictly a forest bat. And one of the real keys is they need standing dead trees, and especially standing dead trees that have peeling bark on them, because they get up underneath that peeling bark, and that's where they roost. Primarily south of I-80. Here in Iowa, and fairly common by the time you get here into the southern, kind of the south central portions of the state. And all of our local Indiana bats, they hibernate in caves down in Missouri and Arkansas, places like that. Here's just a shot of that opening shot on my very first slide was an Indiana bat. And this is one of the bats that's actually really mild-mannered and quite gentle. And so whenever I catch Indianas, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has given me tags that I put on them, and I'm the only person in Iowa or in the U.S. that has orange tags. So that way, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service goes into these mines and caves where they're hibernating to count bats, they can recognize, which state the bats are from based on what color the tags are. And then sometimes we also stick radio tags on them. And so the picture on the left there is a bat where we shaved a little bit of the hair between the shoulder blades and then just used surgical glue to put a radio transmitter on to figure out where they're roosting during the day, what kinds of habitats are they roosting in, and then specifically what kinds of trees are they roosting in, and where are those trees in relation to like the forest edge and things along those lines. But this is one of my favorite bats in the state. And then another one of my favorite bats in the state is the northern long-eared bat, another little guy, and it's also an insect eater, but it's one of the few bats on Earth that actually also eats a lot of spiders. And so when we catch them, it's not uncommon, maybe 1 out of every 10 or so will have spider webs somewhere on it. They'll hover in front of the spider web and pull the spider out of its web. This guy is declining so fast from white nose syndrome that it's actually been put on the endangered species list at the threatened level, but it's being evaluated right now, and I think pretty quickly it's going to actually be bumped up to the endangered level also. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, in a typical summer of netting, this is actually one of the bats that I target. So kind of realize that I'm targeting, trying to catch this species. But I'll usually catch 30 to 50 of them or so over the course of a summer. And I now have not seen one for almost 2 years. So that's how badly they have declined because of this fungus. Eastern red bats, really common. This is also one of the ones that people see a lot because they roost out in the leaves of the trees. And they also come out to fly early. So it'll often be light enough that when they're out and flying that you can tell that it's an orangey colored bat. Males are this real bright orange that you can see here. Females are kind of more of a brick red in color. But their body is designed to handle the cold. You can see that they have fur extending quite a ways out onto the wings, which other bats don't have. The back side of their tail membrane is completely furred, which you can see in that picture. And then they have kind of short ears, and the ears are short enough that they actually can tuck the ears back into the hair. So the fact that they're roosting out in the leaves of the trees means that cold nights in spring, cold nights in fall, they're exposed to pretty nasty temperatures. So you have to be able to handle that kind of condition. They also don't live as long as other bats do. Bats are kind of amazing in how long they live. With big brown bats, the most well-known species on Earth, probably having an average lifespan of 10 to 12 years. We think red bats are probably more like 3 or 4 years. So that's probably because they're roosting out there in the leaves of the trees. And then its close relative, the hoary bat, this is the biggest bat in Iowa. So a big female will have a wingspan now of about 18 inches. And females, by the way, in the bat world are about 10 to 20% larger than males. So yeah, big female will be almost 1.5 feet in terms of their wingspan, but yet they still don't really weigh that much. So this is the guy I was saying, the biggest bat in Iowa still weighs about 2 car keys or less. These guys we rarely catch in our nets, but if you use some sort of a bat detector where you can hear the bats, and some of the bat detectors actually identify the bats for you, you actually hear hoary bats fairly commonly. So they're pretty common, but they fly up high, so they don't come down to the level of our mist nets very commonly. These guys also are declining. Eastern red bats, the previous map, they're also declining. Those two we think are declining because of impacts with wind turbines. Okay, and then let's now jump into our last little section here where we kind of talk about some of these important issues. So the first one, I've made this comment a couple of times about white nose syndrome. So it's a fungus. It's a European fungus that was accidentally brought to the United States. We think it was probably brought here by cavers. And what it does is when the bats go into the caves to hibernate in winter, they come in contact with the fungus. The fungus quickly grows. It grows on their wings. It grows on their nose. This is actually a picture I took of a bat down in eastern Iowa that has the fungus growing on its nose. And more or less what it does is it itches them. And it itches them enough that it wakes them up. And if you wake up a number of times during hibernation, you burn your fat and you don't survive until spring. So they basically wake up too often. This is impacting quite a few species, but the biggest impacts are on little brown bats, northern long-eared bats. With both of those guys, I've already made comments that their numbers are declining. And then one of the species I didn't show you a little section on is the tricolored bat. That's who this picture is a tricolored bat. That's one of the other ones that is really being pounded by this fungus. It very commonly leads to scenes like that, just thousands of dead bats laying on the floor of a mine or a cave. It's caused reductions in the populations of those 3 species, little browns, northern long-eareds, and tricolored bats of between 93 to 100% in the states in the eastern US. So huge rates of loss. And the last time somebody guessed on numbers was about 2 years ago, and that's where that 7 million bats came from, but I'll bet we're probably well up over 10 million bats. But bats are such important players in ecosystems that there's been a lot of questions as to how is this going to impact ecosystems when you're removing such an important key player in ecosystems, and we just don't know the answer to that yet. And there's also some concerns that we may actually have some extinctions. There's a number of bats in Iowa, not in Iowa, but in the eastern US that are already in big trouble anyways, and this could actually drive them to extinction. Here's a map showing you, and this has a lot on it, but the red X right there shows you where we think that cave right there in New York State was where it was first, the fungus was first introduced. And then all the different colors are showing you the different years. Oops, come back here. And so basically what you're seeing is it just kind of spread out from that point. So it got out here into the Midwest, and that's the greens. Then the yellows were the next year. The reds were just last year. So in fact, down here in the lower right, it's showing you that the reds are 2021. So it's just kind of spread out, and it's obviously going to quickly kind of cover the entire US. There is quite a bit of research, by the way, and it's possible that there might be some solutions to this. And so in particular, kind of one of the more promising ones is there's a vaccine that you can give. And the thought is that they can put the vaccine into like a gelatinous form and just go into caves and just rub little bits of this gelatinous stuff on each bat. And then as the bats groom themselves, they'll actually be eating the vaccine. So there's some promise that might help. We're still going to see giant losses, but maybe we won't literally see extinctions, and maybe things will come back faster because some of these solutions that we're coming up with. We'll do this one real fast, just because we're running out of time. Wind turbines are an important source of mortality. You can see there the bats that are really being hammered. So eastern red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haired bats, all 3 of those guys face high rates of mortality at wind turbines. We're not 100% sure, but it actually looks like they may be attracted to the turbines for some reason. Every wind turbine that's ever been studied has had at least some mortality, and some of them are killing big numbers. there was some modeling done, mathematical modeling done a little while ago that says that if we don't do anything about this, that hoary bats will go extinct from this, and eastern red bats may also. But there are some modifications. There's been some research into how to modify the turbines, and I think there's going to be solutions to this. I think it's going to be probably still another 5 or 10 years, but I think we've got, there's some really promising results being found. So I think we can get around this problem and have wind energy and also still have some bats. But then we'll finish this with a little bit of a conversation about bats and COVID. So I don't know how much you have heard, but you'll hear this comment that, many scientists think that bats were the source of COVID-19. And so let's talk just a little bit about that. So the virus that causes COVID-19 is, you already know this, it's what's called a coronavirus. But coronaviruses, that's a huge family of viruses. There's literally at least thousands of species of coronaviruses, probably more like tens of thousands of species. They're very widespread around the world, and they're found in all sorts of mammals, all sorts of birds. Most of them have no impact on humans. Some of the ones that do have really mild impacts, like the cold. Obviously, the one that causes COVID-19, though, is a different story. As soon as the disease was kind of hitting the fan, the scientists very quickly isolated the virus from humans. They sequenced its DNA, and then they compared that to all other known sequences of DNA. And what they found was there's a very close match to the virus that actually causes the disease in humans to a virus that's found in a guy called the horseshoe bat that lives in Southeastern Asia and China. So in particular, this guy, Rhinolophus affinis. It's about a 96% match. So the DNA is so similar that scientists are pretty darn sure that this is the virus that ultimately became COVID-19, or at least the virus that causes COVID-19. But that 4% difference between the virus in us and the virus in bats probably represents about 30 to 40 years worth of time. So in other words, scientists don't literally think that the virus came straight from Rhinolophus, the horseshoe bat, right to humans. The thought is that it probably sat in a third animal for 30 or 40 years. It went through mutations there, it evolved in that other animal, and then it came to humans. That's the kind of leading guess as to where this came from. And this is actually not new. There's been a number of other viruses that have come from bats to humans, and they almost always follow that same path. They go from the bats to some sort of a third animal, and then from that animal, they come to us. And so some of the things that have been involved in the past are camels, in one case, and then civets, which are this kind of almost cat-like group that are actually eaten widely as a food source in some countries. So that path of bats to a third species and then to humans is a fairly common path. Now, we don't actually know who this bridge animal for COVID-19 is, but one of the guesses that it might be pangolins, and that's the picture down there in the lower right. That's a pangolin. But what we do know from other diseases is that the bridge animal almost certainly has some sort of a relationship with humans. So it's not some wild critter that lives out in the middle of nowhere and never interacts with us. It's probably something that is one of our agricultural animals, or it's an animal that we use for medicinal uses, or maybe it's one that we use for food uses. So the virus then jumped from the bat into this critter. This critter has a relationship with us in some way, whether it wants to have the relationship or not, and then it jumped into us from there. That's the guess. Bats do carry lots of viruses, and this particular set of statements right here, we could talk for 2 hours just about this. But bats do carry lots of viruses. And we think there's some pretty kind of just natural biological reasons why this happens. And I won't really go into those. But they do carry lots of them. And in fact, we know that bats, including some here in the US, do carry lots and lots of different types of coronaviruses. So one of the questions is, they've been carrying these viruses for thousands of years. Why is it that they're just now starting to cause problems? So fairly recently, we've had a couple of outbreaks of various coronaviruses that have come from bats to humans, and they've created problems. So you may remember, those of you who are old enough may remember the SARS outbreak back in 2002. That was a coronavirus that came from bats. That one went through civets. then MERS, and that's what Mid-Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. That went through camels. It actually had a really high mortality rate, but it didn't spread very well. And so it was just a little localized thing, but it had people scared for a little while. So there's a couple of examples. Pandemic, it's going to involve coronaviruses, it's going to involve bats in Southeast Asia. So they exactly nailed it. So where there's very, very widespread use of wildlife for food and medicine, et cetera. Okay, so we'll go into those things. Then this is my last slide. So we'll do, actually I have then kind of a fun slide at the end. We'll do this last one and we'll talk a little bit about kind of those three pieces. So again, going back, here's the three things that they use to predict where the virus is going to explode. So let's talk about those. So when humans deforest areas and when we then spread into ecosystems, what that does is it increases our contact with wildlife. We come in more contact with wildlife, and oftentimes we're coming in contact with wildlife that has never interacted with humans before. Okay. On top of that, when you have human and wild habitats that are kind of mixing together, that now means that you've got different species of animals that are interacting with each other, animals that never interacted with each other before. And again, we think that one of the important things is, and so I like this picture down in the lower right, but the one thing the picture doesn't show you is embedded within that rainforest out there are farms. And in those farms are humans, and the humans have cats, they have dogs, they have goats, they have chickens, they have all the things that farmers often have with them. All those things are now interacting with wildlife around them, interacting with wildlife that they've never interacted with before. When wildlife interact with each other, you can spread viruses between them. A virus can then move into a new species and it can evolve into something brand new there. So the more we set the stage for interaction between humans and organisms that used to live out in the middle of the rainforests, the more we're going to have this. And on top of that, climate change is now causing an additional stressor. Climate change stresses animals. When animals are stressed, their immune system is low. It also forces organisms to move all around the world. We're seeing organisms move. And as they move, they now come into contact with new species. As they come into contact with new species, they share viruses with them. But those animals that are moving are now coming in contact with naive populations of humans. And when you hear a disease expert talk about a naive population, it means a population of humans that has never encountered this disease before. So we've got organisms that are moving into places where the humans have not encountered that wildlife species, and they haven't encountered the diseases that are being carried by that wildlife. So essentially then it is our increasing population and our spread out into nature that is really creating these problems. It isn't literally the fault of the bats themselves. Okay, so with that, I'll just show you a pretty picture here of some cool bats from, these are all guys down from the tropics. And I show these mostly because we've been focusing on bats in Iowa, and I just wanted to show you a couple more neat bats that live in other parts of the world. And with that, I think I will open it up. If you have any questions that you want to ask about, we can talk about things. Yeah, so I think if you have questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and fire away. I'll put that, if anybody wants any more details on, I did a lot of work trying to look at all the latest papers on COVID-19 and other kinds of viruses and bats. So there's some good readings if you're interested in looking at those. I'll just leave that there while we have our questions.
Dr. Bennett, I may have missed it when you were explaining about the bat in the photograph that did not have a tail membrane. Did you actually tell us what the purpose of that bat for not having a tail membrane?
I kind of indirectly told you. They don't have a tail membrane largely because they don't need it. because they're not feeding on insects. Because they're a nectar and pollen feeder, they don't need to scoop anything up there. And because you can use your wings to carry out all of the steering, you also don't need the tail membrane for that. So you see that quite often in critters. If a structure, if you have to expend energy as a baby growing the structure, but yet the structure doesn't do you any good, then organisms often get rid of that structure. So that's why we think that over time it got rid of its tail membrane. It's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, we have a lot of the large brown bats, and the concern is always that expressed that they might have rabies, not only for humans but for pets. Just curious, what is the risk of rabies associated with the bats around here?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that's one that I always wait for somebody to ask a question about in order to get into it. So that has, up until fairly recently, that was very hard to study. In the old days, the only way you could tell if an organism had rabies was to catch it and to kill it and remove its brain, and then you had to smear its brain onto a slide and then stain it. And so you had to kill the critter. So it was just hard to do all that research. So we didn't know much, but about 10 or 12 years ago, they figured out a genetic way to test for the presence of rabies. And so now there's kind of been an explosion in research into how many critters out in the wild have rabies. And there was one paper, one of the first papers that came out actually specifically looked at big brown bats. And they tested, I don't remember the exact numbers, somewhere in the vicinity of 270 big brown bats in a couple of barns in Indiana, and none of them had rabies. So the thought is that bats probably have about the average for all mammals rabies rates. So in other words, about 1 out of 1,000 animals at any given time will have rabies. And so that's really a typical ratio for all mammals. Now there's a couple of bats, silver-haired bats in particular, seem to be carrying rabies more often than other bats, but most of them are probably just a standard mammalian rate. And the other trick is that bats don't go through what we refer to as the excitable stage. When a bat has rabies, it kind of gets mad at the world, or when another organism has rabies, it gets mad at the world, runs around and bites things and spreads rabies. Bats don't do that. They get sick and they die, or they get a little bit sick and then they get better and then they're immune to rabies. So one of those two things happen, but they don't run around and intentionally bite things. Now you don't mess around with it, and it's essentially an always fatal disease. I mean, I think 2 people have survived it. But both of those had massive brain injuries. So it's essentially an always fatal disease. So you don't mess around. If you get bit, you get the shots. It's that simple. But in reality, the risk from rabies, especially here in the U.S., is not very high. I think across North America and Canada, what is it, like a 1.5 people per year die from rabies or something like that, compared to about 30 people who die from lawnmower accidents. So again, it's not that you don't take precautions, but you just kind of realize that the risk is not as great as people think. Okay.
Great, thank you very much.
You bet.
Now, kind of hitting on the other misconception is that bats want to drink your blood and they're after